The sea is not a place for the faint of heart. She can be dangerous, fickle, and those that traverse such a place have to be brave, adaptable, and, well, honestly, a little bit different. Life at sea attracts folks for a variety of reasons, but ships throughout history have traditionally been a place that welcomes those across societal backgrounds. There were those of noble birth, commoners, people of different nationalities, language, age, ability, and whether it was acknowledged or not, sexuality as well. They had their hierarchy, sure, but they were all quite literally in the same boat, and they worked together as a team despite differences. Hello, and welcome back to another Tall Ship Tuesday. If you're new here, welcome for the first time, shipmates. My name is Caroline, and we are excited to bring you this new style of video on this channel. If you've been following us for a while, this is definitely a bit different. In case you missed it, we are switching it up here on Tall Ship Tuesday. Rather than one 3 to 4 minute video weekly, we're posting 1 minute bite-sized TSTs each week on Shorts, Reels, and TikTok. So follow at Tall Ship Providence across platforms if you want to see those videos. Then, once a month, check in here for a much longer video where we can really dig into a topic. If you want to watch some of our recent Tall Ship Tuesdays, you can check out our shorts that we have linked up in the corner or down below deck in the description. And if you're interested in maritime history, tall ships, marine science, and much more, then go ahead, click the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with a friend who might want to learn something new. Now that that is out of the way, here at Tall Ship Providence, because June is Pride Month, we wanted to celebrate with a look at queer sailors through the 18th to 21st centuries in the Western world. We will spend the first half of this video focusing on traditional sailing ships of the 18th and 19th century in Britain and the United States during the Age of Sail. I do want to emphasize that there is a lot to say about this topic outside of a Western focus, and we would love to talk about that in a future video, but because our ship, Providence, was a part of the Continental Navy and there was significant influence from Britain at that time, we are going to focus more on the Western influences and how they relate to our ship and the legacy of tall ship sailing in the United States today. As we explore queerness at sea, I do also want to examine this idea of found family and acceptance on ships, how that has evolved through the years, and why that might be. So, strap in and welcome to our very first video essay here on the Tall Ship Providence YouTube channel. Something that I've noticed in my time working on tall ships is that there are quite a few of us that identify as queer. I have found my community here on Providence, as have many other LGBTQ+ sailors. We may even hear from one of these sailors towards the end of our video today, but for now, what is it that called us here? What is it about working on tall ships that resonates? And no, it is not just because Our Flag Means Death is a great show, but seriously, if you haven't seen it, while it is of course not 100% accurate, there is certainly some truth as to what the show portrays in terms of life at sea in that era, especially as it relates to queer sailors. So let's start at the beginning. Who worked on 18th century tall ships? First, it is important for context to learn about what roles were common on board these ships and what the socioeconomic backgrounds were of the folks in these roles. This can start to illuminate why LGBTQ+ sailors may have felt at home on the water even in the Age of Sail, and lay the groundwork for queer sailors to continue the tradition into the 21st century. During the Age of Sail, there were somewhat rigid class distinctions on merchant and naval ships. Class distinctions between those in charge and those of lower rank was as intrinsic as the names of the roles themselves. The words captain, lieutenant, admiral, these were all French in origin, whereas working roles like seaman, boatswain, midshipman, those all have Anglo-Saxon origins. A literal divide in language is what divides the officers from the rest of the crew. Learning French also was more common amongst those of the upper classes, so it kind of makes sense that the aristocracy might take their naming conventions from that source. While it wasn't a rule, in general, those that had higher positions were of higher social standing. This was because people with influence would send their children aboard as young as 8 years old. Those that were of more noble birth would find themselves in line to be trained for higher level positions from a much younger age than the average sailor. They often would not start out as officers, obviously they were 8 years old, but instead as servants, midshipmen, or mates that would be taught the ways of the sea. They would spend years learning about sailing from all angles, so they would have the skills needed from navigation to sail trimming, gunnery, and more. Given their station before boarding these vessels, these men were generally expected to act and dress like gentlemen at all times. The dress regulations would even enforce this practice and be codified in the Continental Navy by 1779. Like I mentioned, these positions were often bought either through influence or the literal exchange of money, but if you impressed the right people, there was room to work your way up through the ranks. There were other officer roles that could get you noticed and put you in the running to become a captain or officer one day. Warrant officers could be described as a specialist representing one or more of the skilled trades employed aboard a ship. Examples of such trades included carpentry, navigation, medicine, artillery, and sailmaking. Most warrant officers were not commissioned, but were tradesmen that were brought aboard ships with or without sailing experience. You can imagine this brings a level of diversity to the crew. It invites more than just the aristocracy, but also today's equivalent of blue-collar workers who could be from a variety of different backgrounds. That being said, you can probably also see how these roles could be looked down upon by higher-level officials. While these folks weren't the top of the food chain, though, they absolutely were not the bottom either. The able seamen, ordinary seamen, and landsmen were the manpower on board these vessels. According to NAM Rodger, who, by the way, was a great reference for much of this section of the video, these seamen might be commonly divided on ships as petty officers and able. Essentially, those who have skill and those that don't. Some of the skilled sailors may be promoted to petty officers or supervisors in charge of small teams or who were skilled in specific functions of the ship. Those that were able would have represented the bodies that physically could be trained to do the job, like seamen and landsmen. In British navies, the proportion of landsmen and boys was kept below 25%. At the same time, it was only considered necessary to have another 25% experienced and able seamen on board, while the remaining 50% could safely be made up of low-skilled common ratings, often recent landsmen themselves. These folks were from all socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, and nationalities. They were welcomed somewhat indiscriminately, as for much of the Royal and Continental Navy's histories, they were in desperate need of anyone who had any amount of sailing experience. Naval ships also needed many more to staff these ships compared to merchant vessels, since there were more roles and duties that needed to be fulfilled in times of war. In the merchant service, there was much less regulation, and that changed how socioeconomic stratification would have influenced the crew. In this field, crews were small, hierarchies flat, cargo ownership shared, and the powers of the captain limited both by custom and the force of communal disapproval in the home port, usually a small town or village where most of the crewmen lived with their families. These merchantmen might have brought with them some of this egalitarian ideology when they enlisted in the service during times of war, especially in places like Britain. Enlisted is a generous word because many of the merchantmen in the service were not there because they wanted to. They were kidnapped from their towns in a process called impressment. Because there were not enough qualified seamen to make the numbers needed to fully crew their warships, men were sometimes violently taken from their towns and made to work on these ships. At the time, through about the mid-1750s, this act was not widely approved of by the general public, but was often thought of as a necessary evil when it came to war. One sailor said of the experience, "For however unconstitutional it may be to deprive this useful class of people of their liberty above all others, it is an act of necessity that cannot be dispensed with, and whoever coolly considers the nature of the thing will soon be convinced that it is the mode, and the only mode, that upon an emergency will or can humble the arrogance and influence of the House of Bourbon. Seamen were not much wanted, and seamen were to be procured, at all events, to bring affairs to a happy crisis. Such are the methods frequently made use of to obtain seamen for the service in this land of liberty." This sailor felt overlooked, and it is true that they were not valued in society. There's almost this biting sarcasm underneath this quote, especially when he says, "Seamen were now much wanted, and seamen were to be procured." It tells you how the sailor felt about society, like, oh, now you want us? They were different, many of lower socioeconomic standing, and they were unwanted, except when they could be exploited. There are a lot of social groups that feel this way and have throughout history. These groups long for belonging and connection with others. Sailors had this community kind of built in, returning to their ships and coastal communities on land where they could build their own families. So when I first started really researching this topic of queer folks on ships through maritime history, one of the first sources I found said something rather intriguing and maybe a tad controversial. There is a scholar who I've already referenced in this video, N.A.M. Rodger. Well, Rodger is a leading expert in naval history in the Age of Sail. He did have an interesting take on the rate of homosexuality in the Navy in the 18th century, around the same time that our ship Providence sailed. In his book, The Wooden World, An Anatomy of the Georgian Navy, he devotes only a few paragraphs to the topic of LGBTQ+ sailors. He wrote that a ship at sea was about the most difficult possible place to commit sodomy, and moreover, it was almost the only crime in the Navy for which the death penalty was often awarded. All these cases add up to a very insignificant total, a score or so of known influences over a period of nearly 9 years, during which at least 100,000 individuals must have served in the Navy. It is difficult to believe that there can have been any serious problem with a crime so much detested, but so seldom mentioned. In this section, he briefly talks about several cases of sodomy, as it was referred to in that period of history, and the outcomes of some of these cases in the courts, if they even made it that far. Rodger comes to the conclusion that because naval vessels were so often in port and had many women to call upon, and that it would have been difficult to hide a gay affair on a crowded naval ship, that there actually weren't that many gay people in the Navy. They had their needs met and therefore didn't have to resort to sodomy, which, I mean, fair, perhaps that was the case, but that kind of seems unlikely, right? A recent study puts the figure as high as 10% of the global population who identify as part of the LGBTQ+ community. Even if just a fraction of that number would have acted on that in a society that was less than accepting, that still would have been thousands of queer people on these ships. Dr. Seth Stein-LeJacq found that by the Napoleonic Wars, there's evidence that some captains and other officials had concerns about rising cases of sodomy. One sea captain, Captain A. Griffiths, writing, "The crime increased to a most alarming extent in 1824. There was a spike of trials at the end of the 18th century and into the early 19th century, but as mentioned before, at its peak was only about 24 sodomy cases a year in a Navy of over 140,000. A drop in the bucket. So even while increasing scrutiny, it still didn't transfer to too many more trials. If it were really that big a deal and hard to conceal, then why exactly was the number not higher? Well, Paul Baker and Joe Stanley, two historians who wrote Hello Sailor, The Hidden History of Gay Life at Sea, seem to also have come across this passage from Rodger. They also felt that it was unlikely that there were so few instances of homosexuality, and that perhaps there were reasons as to why the anti-sodomy laws were not widely enforced. They rebut the lack of existing formal evidence today should be read not as evidence of homosexuality's rarity. Rather, it could be seen as evidence that it was just too minor an offense to be punished from on high, just as the presence of women on board was ignored by officials unless it was seen to result in trouble. Essentially, it was a better outcome for officers to turn a blind eye to those who engage in sodomy, rather than risking these sailors to mutiny or desert the Navy and allow the crews of these ships to maintain a happy workforce. Baker and Stanley also invoke the late Suzanne Stark, who wrote Female Tars, Women Aboard Ships in the Age of Sail. Stark, in her research, noted that there was a sort of tribalism that developed on ships. Tribalism in this sense meaning that there were bonds made with one another, all fighting on the same side and for a common goal, that it created a sort of group identity for the whole. In relation to acceptance of LGBT folks, sailors would repeatedly report that if you pull your weight, then you can be forgiven for almost anything. That gay guy was seen as all right if he was our gay guy. This tribalism is not unsurprising. There are very specific ties that develop when a group lives together for months on end with no contact with other outgroups, especially when any contact you do have is with enemy ships that can force bonds to become even stronger. There's a loyalty to this family that is created. There are deep bonds where there are social, political, and even physical consequences for breaking on board these ships. Even today, if you are on a ship that goes on longer voyages, the community that you build becomes your little universe. Before we leave the Age of Sail, though, I would be remiss if I did not discuss pirates. I mean, how many of you clicked on this video thinking about Our Flag Means Death or Black Sails, right? Along with the rest of this period of history, we do need to read in between the lines a little bit. We don't necessarily have evidence of queer pirates, but what we do have is what these, mostly men, stood for in their time, and the evidence of these values left in their wake. When talking about pirates, there's obviously the side of them that is violent, aggressive, at war against all mankind. But Hans Turley in Rum, Sodomy, and the Lash analyzed pirates and how their stories have been portrayed over time and discovered some interesting retellings of this history, giving a glimpse deeper into the menace they plagued along the coast. Perhaps some pirates were at war against all mankind because they were dissatisfied with the class distinctions that constructed their lot in life. This idea comes from a Marxist perspective when exploring this history, but there is some evidence that may give this hypothesis some extra credibility. Many of these pirates were against the system that they lived in, preferring a democracy where they all had a say, rather than a monarchy where they did not. They wanted freedom to progress in life from their lowly station, find riches and freedom of the sea in the process. There was even a society set up in Madagascar between 1690 and 1723 that ran on this principle of democracy, where they all had a say in what they did. Many of the things they did were, in fact, atrocities, like slavery, which kind of undermines the egalitarian point and the freedom point that many try to make when referring to a pirate's life at sea. Regardless, pirates were a social outgroup in polite society. They were not bound by any social conventions except their own. In a homosocial environment, it follows that these pirates likely were not bound to rigid structures around sexuality, when having such freedom in other aspects of their lives? There are many readings of pirates and their lives that allude to this throughout history. For a full deep dive into this concept, I do recommend Rum, Sodomy, and the Lash. It explores pirate myth through the years and what it says about our values as a society, especially in regards to masculinity. Definitely an interesting read. I have it linked in our adventure page below deck, where we also go a bit deeper into one of the concepts of a future section in this video, so head below deck to check that out now. As we move forward in time, as the shipbuilding industry changed and developed, so too did the demographics of those working and living aboard ships. Before the 1900s, all ships were made out of wood. As we move on to the 19th century, these shipbuilding techniques don't entirely disappear, but especially towards the end of the 19th century, there is rapid innovation. In 1801, one of the first steam-powered vessels, the Charlotte Dundas, was built. By the 1840s, propellers were introduced and replaced wheels in steamships. The age of sail lasted from 1570 through about 1860. During the latter half of the century, with these significant changes in everything from shipping to naval voyages to passenger transport, there was less danger when it came to sailing the high seas because of all these things, and so no longer would sailors fear returning with only 10% of their complement. Now, they were able to revolutionize the transportation industry from one of survival to one of hospitality. Now those who worked in this industry became primarily dominated by women and less masculine men. This mirrored the shift on land that was seen in the hospitality industry. But unlike their land counterparts, there were some additional freedoms that arose for self-expression of LGBTQ+ sailors. I will say these industries had many regulations over the social and personal lives of those that were part of the crew. Naval ships over the years began to increasingly expel queer sailors. Merchant ships were slightly more forgiving, but not necessarily welcoming to LGBTQ+ folks. Passenger ships, though, became a place where sailors could work with less fear of being discovered, but additionally found others like themselves. The sea became a place for queer sailors to socialize and be themselves. By the 20th century, the sea became a popular place for LGBTQ+ folks. Those that worked on these ships said that they estimated anywhere from 30 to 50% of the crew was gay at any given time. Some of those interviewed thought it could even be as high as 90% on a select few ships. It may have been the anonymity provided by a nomadic lifestyle that offered protection. It may have been the fact that a voyage created this liminal space, an in-between where the rules of society lessened. Perhaps it simply was the invigorating maritime air could be blamed if someone became out of control or simply different from their usual selves at home. There were thriving gay bars and clubs on ships. Drag nights and cross-dressing were common forms of entertainment. It was in these camp gay spaces where queerness was celebrated that a distinct language emerged. This language was helpful to these LGBTQ+ sailors to hide their identities in more public forums, but it was most importantly a language that allowed them to build a community together. Polari is a mix of several different languages, but it has its roots in thieves' cant. According to Baker and Stanley in Hello Sailor, The Hidden History of Gay Life at Sea, this language changed over time, from thieves' cant to one called Polari. Polari was used mostly by rogues and beggars. This then passed on to sailors due to English laws established around 1713. These laws made wandering for showmen, players, beggars, and peddlers illegal, but it didn't make the same distinction for sailors. Thus, many of these groups would pretend to be sailors to get around this law, and thus sailors began to take on parts of Polari. From there, a lexicographer in the 1950s named Eric Partridge put the split of Polari to our secret gay language, Polari, at some time in the 1800s. It happened along with the proliferation of theatre in England and was centered around London. At this point, the language was used by those in the performing arts mostly, not just by the gay population, of which there were quite a few in the theatre scene at that time. A side note that I think is very interesting, for those that have never worked on ships, there is a huge overlap between theater and ships. We have similar superstitions, there are these little traditions in tech, theater, and boat that totally overlap. Skills between riggers are very transferable in both worlds. You go aboard a tall ship, there's a 99% chance that at least one member of the crew has worked in professional theater. I can guarantee it. Anyway, back to Polari. Though it was entirely a spoken language, so most of the documentation of this language comes from relatively recently, Polari draws from the cant of traveling showmen and criminals, Italiente lingua franca, picked up by men serving in the Navy, the Romani language, and the jargon of the theatrical community, amongst many other potential historical sources. Polari was also influenced by British rhyme, backwards words, Yiddish slang, and in later years, the American military led to the addition of quite a few words. So, how did it make its way to sea? Well, it became popular in the merchant navy when actors and theater performers would find their way onto passenger ships during the off-season or in between jobs. Given that it also has its roots in lingua franca, a very international pidgin language, this Polari, anyway, likely partially arose from sailors as well, and there wasn't much of a jump to make. From there, sailors across different ships from the Navy to the merchant service were making use of Polari. This language allowed those in the know, gay seafarers, or sea queens as they would have referred to themselves, it allowed them to talk about the queer world without those of the outgroup finding out or understanding what was being said. Scholar Anthony Hackett even posits that Polari, for this reason, was a subversive act that enabled individuals to normalize a subcultural group. So let's learn a few words that this group used and see what they may have valued as a subcultural group as a result. When referring to folks, they would have switched around the gender associated with each word. So their pronouns, he, would have been she. And vice versa, she would have been he. Definitely would have come in handy when talking about a partner in those days, making it seem as though one was talking about the opposite gender. So, what would they use to describe these people? Of course, they had lots of different names for different types of people. A man would have been Omi or Homi. Poloni would have been woman. Omi Poloni was a gay man, and Poloni Omi was a lesbian. Sea Queen meant a gay sailor. And a side note, something interesting that language can tell you is what a community thinks is important. We have one word for love, but in ancient Greek there were several, all describing different kinds of love, showing that sort of importance that they placed on love as a society. Well, in a period of over-policing of gay people, there are a plethora of words in this language describing the police. This would have been Jennifer Justice, Betty Bracelets, Hilda Handcuffs, Lily Law. They also had many words referred to body parts, clothes, makeup, and the like. All were helpful in describing the things that were not socially acceptable for men or women of the era to be wearing in public. So you can see in a picture like this, there were lots of different things that they would use to describe different parts of the body, different people, things like that. Then we move on to adjectives. Bona, fantabulosa, dolly, all meant good. Tat, naff, cod, all meant bad. Then you've got for the word effeminate things like camp, queenie, swishing, screamy, dizzy. For masculine, the word butch. Now, there were also many acronyms. TBH, not to be honest, but instead meant to be had or available. NTBH was not to be had or not available. Then you had VAF, Vada, absolutely fantabulosa. In the gay scene on land and at sea, the language of Polari was passed down from older queens to younger. They created this family tradition that was handed down through generations of seafarers. The found family and the bonds out at sea were strengthened by the language shared amongst them. Many words were given new context as a result of building this chosen family. You might have heard some of these family ties, especially in the drag scene nowadays, but mother was a mentor welcoming a new gay man into the queer scene. Sisters was a best friend or sometimes an enemy. Auntie, an older, unattractive gay man, or a husband, a masculine partner. Unfortunately, though, Polari is no longer spoken in full today. It was used up until about the 1970s when it fell out of the gay vernacular. Around this time, the language was becoming known outside of just the in-group, and thus was not as safe to use as it once was. From the 70s through the 80s, there's not much note of Polari outside of the occasional word or two used in meeting places and clubs. Today, we see bits and pieces show up in gay speak in LGBTQ+ spaces, like I said, specifically in the drag community. This, however, again, is only a few words and concepts. But in the 1990s, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, a group founded in 1978 to promote queer joy and liberation, decided to adopt Polari as the language of the occasion. It represented in itself a sacrament, revered and passed down from generation to generation of initiates. Yet it is more than a mystical language, half forgotten and only half understood. It is also the language of irony and parody, as are the sisters' celebrations themselves. Essentially, the sisters, ever camp that they are, decided to parody Latin, finding another dead language to use, this one from their own community.
Hi everyone, my name is Josie and I'm a deckhand here at Providence as well as a historical interpreter. I want to take a second to jump back to modern times and emphasize how important our version of Providence has been to me on my journey of self-discovery and belonging as a member of the LGBTQ+ community myself. Earlier in the video, Caroline returned to the concept of found family on ships a few times, and I have certainly experienced that here with many of the people I've met while working aboard Providence. At our workplace, we are a caring and attentive team, always at the ready, checking in on each other, making group coffee runs, teaching each other new things about the ship. I greatly appreciate how if one of us is having a hard day or struggling with a new task, the rest of us are not only able to pick up the slack, both literally and figuratively. Oftentimes we leave work in a better mood than when we came to it. Here, I trust that my crewmates have my back. I feel seen, my strengths are well known and acknowledged, and as a team, we celebrate each other's successes and skills with enthusiasm and pride. Outside of work, they become some of my most cherished friendships. I mean, it's hard not to bond when you're aloft working 70 feet in the air together, or spending the day in the heat in Continental Navy uniforms. But truly, I think the things that drew us all to Providence are also what have grown our friendships. A love of adventure, whimsy, and perhaps the most important thing, a killer sense of humor. Together, we tour museums, geek out about new ship facts or books we read, create stories and art through performances, or even Dungeons & Dragons campaigns. The observant and empathetic coworkers I have here are really what makes this place so special to me. Maybe it has something to do with the name Providence, meaning divine guidance or care. There are certainly days I feel I was meant to find this place and these people. They really embody the term and provide me with just that, guidance and care. Being in an environment where I'm not afraid to express myself is so important. This team makes it easier for me to try new things, face my fears, and ask important questions. I think many of the queer sailors who found their home at sea in the past would be so thrilled to see the community we've created here at Tall Ship Providence.
In 2024, there has been a lot of work that progressed inclusion in all aspects of the maritime industry. Today, we see an effort to welcome and celebrate our differences from cruise ships to tall ships. It is in this diversity that we are able to grow and flourish in these communities, and it is in this diversity that we should celebrate and have pride, because that is what life at sea is really about. Tall Ships America has made a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, being anti-racist and encouraging sailors of all genders and sexualities to follow their passions. All of this possible from the hard work of political activists over many, many years. It is no surprise that we see so many queer sailors on tall ships. It has been a long history of LGBTQ+ sailors on the high seas. And even though we may not have all of the written evidence, a little reading between the lines, and the hard work of dedicated historians, we can see the hidden history just beneath the surface. And this is a small portion of the total history of gays at sea. There was so much that I wasn't able to cover in this video. Linked below is our adventure page, which has all of the sources used for this video and hours of further reading on this topic if you're interested. Leave a comment while you're down there if you just learned something new, you want to talk about something that we only just barely touched on and maybe you know a lot about, or if there is a topic you are interested in exploring in a future video essay. If you would like to come aboard our ship and learn about sailing life in the 18th century, feel free to stop by Tall Ship Providence here in Alexandria, Virginia. We have so much to offer, from tours to sails, so check out our website for more information. Thank you all for joining the Tall Ship Providence Foundation on this Tall Ship Tuesday. If you liked this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. We put out new educational videos about maritime history, seamanship, tall ships, and even the occasional sea shanty each week on Instagram Reels, TikTok, and YouTube Shorts. Then once a month, join us back here on YouTube for our long-form video essay. We hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to share with someone who might want to learn something new, and we will see you back again next week on another Tall Ship Tuesday. Bye.